Alrighty, folks, GP Petrasia has come to an end for us. 1 win, 2 losses. Pretty unfortunate sequence of events in rounds 2 and 3, though admittedly in that final game there, in that final game there, round 3, I made a pretty horrendous mistake that definitely cost us a lot of percentage points. So now's a good time to talk about, how I felt about the deck, what worked, what didn't, as well as the format at large. Now, typically, month 3 formats, getting like a final beat on where the environment is would mostly be critical for knowing what rotation is going to look like. Getting a feel for what cards are still going to have some power as Hyperpop leaves and whatever set comes in May joins the format. However, next month in April 2025 is not just our usual variant Grand Prix, but also the Revolution World Championships. Unfortunately, this tournament was my last chance to qualify for the Revolution World Championships, so I'm not going to be competing in that event. Don't expect too many videos from me on that, though other content creators on the platform are competing, including Caillou102 and Ricky Rister. I believe Ricky. Yeah, Ricky is competing. So look forward to potentially getting to see some videos from both of them. If I make a video covering what the field looks like as we get into April, which I am hoping to find the time to make a video like that, then I'll be sure to include links to their channels in the description of that video when the time comes. And in fact, I might even come back to this video and add a little annotation up in the top right corner pointing you to that video covering the start of that tournament. So if you are coming back to this final thoughts, I will see you there. As far as where we are now, because the balance of the format is so critical to World Championships, I think we ought to start there. Which is to say, I don't know what patches are going to hit the format in April, but I am very deeply concerned about graveyard decks. I've been kind of concerned about graveyard decks this whole time. February and March both felt like graveyard decks were on a bit of a tear, and there are a lot of things that just feel a little too unchecked right now. I know the curators have expressed interest in getting the set rotating in May to have some form of meaningful graveyard interaction in the set file, just for the sake of making sure that it can help shore up some of the deficits the format has in that regard. But even beyond that, some of our most powerful cards in the format right now are graveyard tools that have proven resilient to graveyard interaction. From big flashy bombs like Scotha and Chronicle of Extinction, to honestly very, calm, unassuming things like Industrialize or Seafloor Treasures or Root Fossil, most notably. There's a lot of power out of the graveyard right now, and it's really difficult that there's no main deckable graveyard hate cards other than Chronicle of Extinction, which is far more than just a graveyard hate card, which results in a lot of tension in the format where, I feel like if I was coming to this tournament just trying to succeed, I would have been best off just bringing a Chronicle of Extinction deck. I think that card is still probably one of the best in the format, just based on how good each of its modes is individually and how powerful having that flexibility is, especially considering the flashback mode is just game ending. Scotha, Titan of Eternal Dusk, is also just brilliantly oppressive card right now. We're seeing some of the best performing decks at this point in the GP. Philippe Sanner, our round 2 opponent, is now 3-0 at time of recording with Scotha as on a 4 of. Lilisaur is 2-0, has not played their third round match yet, but is on a Savvy Smith Lightspeed launcher deck, splashing 1 Forest, 1 Swamp for 3 copies of Scotha, and is 2-0. Scotha is just kind of part of the format right now. And you can either beat it or join it. And one of the things that I'm really struggling with is that beating it feels really hard. Scotha is, and let's just pull up Scotha here real quick. For those of you less familiar, Scotha, that activated ability from the graveyard is essentially 0 mana, add some mana if you have more than 4 lands, target player discards a card. It is so utterly debilitating just on the basis of that graveyard ability. And then you fold in the fact that it also happens when you just cast Skotha from hand or attack with Skotha. The fact that this is always mana positive no matter what you do and is always going to apply pressure to your opponent's resources by attacking their hand. Skotha is just so profoundly difficult to punch through. I honestly am startled that it has taken this long for Skotha to really start thriving, but thriving she is, and it is just all sorts of difficult to fight through. So, to be quite frank, and I've said this a couple times through the GP run, Skotha and the decks that make Skotha work best were a major component in my hesitance to compete in this GP. And it's just sort of a sad reality of, I can either do what I can to get through this like graveyard hate, or I can just try and or like get through this with graveyard hate and with things that I think are good against Skotha, or I can just try and join them. And part of me wonders if I should have just joined them on the Skotha Chronicle of Extinction plan, because it's working for Philippe Sanner. They're 3-0. But at the same time, the other player who brought Philippe's list went 0-2 and dropped from the format, or dropped from the tournament. So hard to say for sure what does and doesn't work. There are definitely decks that seem to be able to beat the Skotha decks, so they're not untouchable. But I feel like they're just such a difficult matchup to fight through. So many things need to go right, and just a few things going wrong can be the end for you. So it's a very frustrating match for me to think about, and I imagine there are going to be some pretty big sweeping changes coming in April to address that. That is most relevant for people competing in World Championships, but is also just going to be nice for us going into May, not having to potentially worry about a format that is so overwhelmingly dominated by these cards, as well as having giving more room for incoming cards in May to have a bit more staying power and splash potential at the start of the month, especially if something happens to hit Chronicle of Extinction again, because this card has just been running over the format since its printing, to my understanding. Even before it was -2/-2, or long before it was -2/-2, but even with it being -2/-2 now, like, it still just devastates boards, devastates hands. It is hard to play around because it handles wide boards and small boards and handles no boards at all. So it always has a like decent enough use case. And the worst case scenario is it has no use. That means that your opponent has no creatures and no cards in hand and nothing they care about in their graveyard. So that's a lot of things that need to be going on for your opponent, and I don't feel like many of those cases are things that are winning them the game. So let's move on from talking about the meta at large. Let's not dwell too much longer on Skotha and Chronicle of Extinction, and let's talk about this deck. So I was definitely surprised going into this tournament to find so many other people on Aqua Crew Flagship. I definitely like this card, but I did not suspect too many people would be too high on it. And then if I recall correctly, 4 other players ended up bringing Aqua Crew Flagship, so it had decent popularity. 5 out of 28 is not too shabby in any capacity. And one of these decks that put it to great use, just going through a quick check here. 4 decks. I was one of 4. So 4 and 28, still pretty good. One of these decks that caught me off guard was the Aqua Crew Flagship Phoenix's deck. And I do kind of wonder if this like Grixis Phoenix deck would have been a better avenue to pursue, but it just ultimately I settled on more of a like hard tempo plan and had some ups and downs. So Lightspeed Launcher and Aqua Crew Flagship felt great. Both of these cards did what they needed to do when I had them. Flagship being Crew 2 for a 4/4 for 3 is great. Honestly, the biggest thing I can say about Flagship is, all of its abilities are nice, and it has me thinking a lot more about Scrapyard Mecha, because they do very similar things in caring about cards going to your graveyard, cards leaving your graveyard, and they are just big, dumb, stompy vehicles. So I might revisit Scrapyard Mecha some point in the future. Card I do definitely have a big love for. Uh, Flagship felt like, what if Scrapyard Mecha could also generate bodies, and that is so phenomenal in terms of just allowing you to recover from even an empty board. Uh, like this card with the right support tools is great. And I will acknowledge that I do think the Grixis surface decks do get to leverage the flagship better, because your best cheap flashback spells in blue-red are Igneous Visions and Industrialize, but in black you get All That Remains, which is just a great card selection tool, and you get Wade Through Spores, which is a nice little discard spell to hit your opponent. And in the case of some players playing Wade Through Spores like Lilithor, they're playing it with JJ Mac, which is not going to be an option come May, because Hyperpop is rotating and taking JJ Mac with it. But I still think Wade Through Spores could be playable with an Aqua Crew flagship shell in blue and black. I think, it's sad to see Lightspeed Launcher go. It was nice to play it before it rotates. Launcher, definitely a fun card. And for all of the bummers that came in matches 2 and 3, I just have to say, match 1, Lightspeed Launcher, all 3 in play, getting to draw 3 cards with each amp up, felt amazing. And up against the deck that I have had to play against every round 1 so far this year, getting to just Lightspeed Launcher them into oblivion was so satisfying. So definitely some fun ups here with our artifacts over the course of this GP. Something I can't quite say the same for is the creature suite. Let's start with the most disappointing here, Scuttling Cicada. I want this card to work. I want this card to be so good. It sure was a 1-mana 1/1 for most of the GP matches that we played. There were moments where it kind of got to do some things by getting surfaced, but it largely was an irrelevant card. One big thing to note about Scuttling Cicada here is I think a deck on Scuttling Cicada is going to want a greater critical mass of draw discard effects. One thing that is definitely worth noting on Cicada is our discard outlets for Cicada are Aqua Crew Flagship, which, as proven through this GP run, tapping to draw a card and discard a card with Flagship is not the most ideal use case. Your best use case of Flagship is animating it and swinging for 4. So Cicada, a little awkward on that front. Savvy Smith, which we would much rather, over the course of this GP, I found I would much rather make the constructs and get things on the board immediately with Savvy Smith, or add mana to try and cast more spells afterwards. So that became a little bit awkward, which really just left Industrialize. And Industrialize is not enough to feed the Scuttling Cicadas into the bin and feed other cards into the bin to try and get up to 7 cards for the surface cost. Nimbus of Thought could also do it, but Nimbus of Thought's just so much mana. It's so unlikely to be relevant early on to get Scuttling Cicada set up. So I think Cicada could still work. I think a deck needs to be more all in on Cicada. It's possible that with Lightspeed Launcher leaving, I can start looking at a blue-black list that runs Aqua Crew Flagship with Scrapyard Mecha and runs Scuttling Cicada as something that you're happy just sending to the bin with either of those big 3-mana artifacts, and having more power behind just getting the Cicada into the bin more reliably. The Anti-Edict tech never really came up, though, unfortunately. Savvy Smith, for its part, made sideboarding very difficult because it places a very awkward constraint on the deck in specifically asking you to cast a bunch of instants and sorceries every turn to maximize its value. There are some decks that can absolutely leverage Savvy Smith to its fullest potential. The Grixis Phoenix decks that are in the tournament are using Savvy Smith to, I think, a much fuller potential than this deck can, thanks in part to Blistering Cryo Phoenix being able to make flashback costs on spells return them to your hand rather than exile. So you have these tools to constantly loop and get value with Savvy Smith. And in fact, in an earlier version of this deck, I was on Blistering Cryo Phoenix. So I think if I had stayed in that lane, then the Savvy Smith probably would have gotten us a bit more reliable value through this GP. But for what it's worth, Savvy Smith did still do a lot of good things for us. So I think there's the deck building cost on Savvy Smith is really high, and it really puts pressure not only on what's in your main deck, but also what sideboard tools you can lean on, because any permanents in your sideboard automatically eat into the things that Savvy Smith counts. But it is also fair to say that Savvy Smith has done some very good things, both for me and for other people in this GP. I think the creature I'm not necessarily like most disappointed in by any measure, but the creature that I wish performed better was Hobbe's Familiar. Definitely had some moments where this thing was just a meaningful enough clock, but Familiar just feels like not quite there. I think especially with Lightspeed Launcher rotating, taking away our most powerful way to just draw a card every turn for the Hobbe's Familiar, that is going to put a lot of pressure on how likely Familiar is to thrive in a post-rotation format. And I think it's a bummer because I think the Familiar is definitely interesting. There are tools to make the Familiar still strong in our current environment. You know, if we go into a field where we're on Deep Treader Arcanist, an Ignited Soul, that plays into a lot of value for Hobbe's Familiar. Scrapyard Mecha loved Hobbe's Familiar, both because it can crew Mecha if we cast it after the Mecha, but also Mecha, the attack trigger on it will draw us a card for Hobbe's Familiar. So if we go to that blue-black build that I'm floating the idea for next month, or in 2 months, Hobbe's Familiar might have some staying power there. I liked getting this up to a decent stat line, but it just felt like such a slog to get there. If you have a deck that can reliably trigger this on your turn and your opponent's turn, then I think Hobbe's Familiar looks a lot better. Like, I almost wonder if there is a world where you can go for a more Esper aggro plan, trying to curve out with like early creatures and then eventually top up to Kanai Stone as just this crazy draw discard engine to help you refuel, pitch away excess lands, and then dig through everything. And then as you're activating Kanai Stone, Hobbe's Familiars gets to proc and start growing. You can Konai Stone on your opponent's turn, draw to discard one. Hobbe's Familiars grow. So there might still be some things to do with Hobbe's Familiar in future formats, but I'm not super optimistic on it for where it was in this particular shell. For our spells, Igneous Visions and Industrialize felt like a nice card selection core. Some awkwardness with Igneous Visions, but that's just kind of something we knew about going in. I know some other decks are on Faces of the Phoenix, and that is definitely a more potent card draw spell, but really in this shell, I wanted to lean on efficiency over the most potent effects, and perhaps that came to my detriment here. For our burn, Firebolt felt better than I was expecting. I kind of felt like I would regret bringing the full play set, but honestly, it did some good work. And the flashback cost, while it is very costly, this card really did get to prove why it was so good in its day in official Magic, and really help us have some staying power later in the game as we develop more mana. Light Vein Arrow, I can take it or leave it. The Scry one is nice on Light Vein Arrow, but we're going to be seeing it rotate, so maybe we can find a better Lightning Strike variant going forward for something like this kind of shell. Similarly, rotating is Refract. Bummer to lose our only instant speed Quench that is not Omen of Deception. But in all honesty, Refract, while it felt nice, also felt really awkward. Having to hold up specifically blue-red for this counterspell made it very awkward in a number of occasions through the GP. Same with Light Vein Arrow. The mana restrictions on these spells felt very real through this run. So having that restriction be alleviated with this card rotating, if we can get another Quench variant, could be pretty nice. But I will still hate to see Light Vein Arrow and Refract go, but that is the nature of rotating formats. As far as sideboards go, the big winner here, Turn to Nyx, felt way better than I thought it would. I anticipated this being something I would board in against the Skotha decks and only the Skotha decks. I should have been on the playset of Turn to Nyx over Refract just in the main. Yes, Refract hits things in the early game better than Turn to Nyx, but at a certain point, so many of the decks in this format are doing a lot with their graveyard, and the ones that aren't are committing a lot of things to the board early, underneath counter spells. So mixed in with our cheap burn spells like Firebolt, like Late Vein Arrow, that we're going to be picking off small things anyways, and other decks that just don't care about the small creatures and are going to fill their graveyards naturally, I kind of wish we'd just been on the 4 Turn to Nyx in the main, and maybe just had the Refracts in the sideboard, or even had Agents of Deception in the sideboard to have more creatures that we could bring in to fight creature matchups. Like I would have much rather had Agent of Deceptions over Refract specifically for our round 1 matchup. And in that case, I would have rather had those in the sideboard and Turn to Nyx in the main. I have been down on Turn to Nyx a lot for a while. The quality of counter spells in Theros Age of Trax is just so high. You have Afara's Judgment, you have Omen of Deception, you have Agent of Deception, you have Divine Mishap. All 4 of those cards are like premium tier competitive staples that have absolutely proven their worth time and time again in the GP field. And Turn to Nyx has kind of been the one left behind. And my goodness, this month has really proven to me people need to stop sleeping on Turn to Nyx. This card is amazingly good in the mid to late game, especially if your opponent's on any sort of graveyard shenanigans. And breaking news, this format's overrun by graveyard shenanigans. So I think Turn to Nyx definitely impressed me. Probably the single happiest deck building decision I have here. I'm very, very content with the choice to run a full playset here, and I just wish they'd been in the main board instead of the sideboard. Flame Whip felt iffy. We only really ran into one matchup where it would have been even remotely good. And quite honestly, it was fine. It was kind of just a serviceable removal spell. I'm not impressed with this. It feels like a kind of just medium okay change. It's definitely more playable than Flame Lash. I'll give it that much. But I kind of just wish I'd had an instant speed removal spell over the Flame Whip. Especially since Terminal Impact was in the sideboard as well, and having a bunch of sorcery speed removal is really awkward. For that matter, Terminal Impact was okay. It was nice having the Terminal Impact as just some uncounterable reach damage against Kumrak in round 3. But this deck, for all of the pressure on trying to develop mana consistently over time, this deck still felt like it was just a little too mana hungry to make Terminal Impact truly meaningful. So hard to really say too much there. Soul Guide Lantern, this just was not a good Soul Guide Lantern shell. Again, Savvy Smith is so demanding on deck building costs that having to board out instants or sorceries for Soul Guide Lantern feels really awkward, but we really don't want to go down creatures for the Lantern because the creatures are also pretty important as well. And then Satyr Arsonist, I was happy with in round 3. I wish I hadn't made such a horrendous misplay with the Satyr Arsonist in round 3, but that's what content's for. Gonna preserve my mistakes for all eternity. Otherwise, yeah, I there were some issues with like running into tapped lands when I really wanted untapped mana. I've been a pretty vocal opponent of 8 fetches. I know a lot of people are big on 4 Primal Fisher for redeveloped Cityscape. I'm very glad I had 10 basics 6 fetches as opposed to 8 and 8. Because believe me, after like turn 1 or 2, if I saw a Cityscape, I was not exactly super pleased. So yeah. That all said, that brings us to an end for this GP. I don't know if I would have run this deck back knowing what the field was. In all honesty, I may have just caved to the king of the meta and just tried out Philippe Sanner's either tried Philippe Sanner's Chronicle deck or joined PTM in the theory crafting of what a Jund build with Warden of Tremors could have looked like. And from what I've seen, PTM has definitely had some success with that against the Skotha deck in particular. Yeah, that wraps up our GP run here, and fortunately, that is not the end of Revolution content this month. Obviously, we have the GP finals soon, inevitably. I will do what I can to record that and get that match up, but Curator's Cube is also happening this month. So Curator's Cube drafts have concluded as of today. I participated in 5 out of the 7 drafts. However, y'all are only going to get to see one of those drafts because we submit one deck list from all of the drafts that we participated in, and then we compete. So you'll get to see the deck that I drafted in short order, and then I will get to play more Magic this month, competing with my draft deck as opposed to this much more carefully constructed one. So yeah, wish me luck on selecting the correct deck for that field and on competing in the second tournament this month. See y'all then.